Last week we considered how the flood of Noach brought an end to what I call the first scriptural age, being in the era between the end of the sixth creative day until the flood. So having seen the end of that era, we, in this 21st century, are now living in the second scriptural age, which I believe will last until beyond the end of the great white throne judgment, when the new heavens and the new earth will come into being. Whether this planet will be destroyed or just reconfigured is something that God has hidden from us at this stage of development. Moshe said in Devarim, Deuteronomy, chapter 29, verse 28, "All things which are hidden belong to Yahweh our God, but the things that have been revealed to us belong to us and our children forever, so that we can observe all the words of Torah." So having acknowledged that we are now living in that second scriptural age, we need to look carefully at the words of Bereshit, Genesis chapter 9, verses 18 through 28, and how they are impacting on the modern state of Israel in this 21st century. Starting in verse 21, we are told how when Noach sampled the first of his wine from his newly planted vineyard, he became drunk and fell asleep naked in his tent. When he awoke, he placed a curse on his youngest grandson, Canaan, the son of Ham. What took place and provoked such a severe curse is not stated. But the outcome of the curse was revealed in verse 25 to 27, where Noach says, "Cursed be Canaan, he will be a servant of servants to his brothers. Blessed be Yahweh, the God of Shem. Canaan will be their servant. May God enlarge Japheth. He will live in the tents of Shem, but Canaan will be their servant." So the words have never been reversed by Yahweh, in whose name Noach made that curse. However, we find that Canaan decided to reside in the very territory that Yahweh later promised to Avram would be the only territory that Yahweh would claim to be exclusively his own. By Yahweh claiming the land of Canaan as his own, he has also made a covenant with Abraham through Yitzhak and Yaakov and their descendants that the territory of Eretz Israel would become their rightful inheritance throughout the whole of the second scriptural age. That same small territory is the one Israel was given full rights of occupancy to as a result of the covenant Yahweh made with Abraham. Yet all the Western nations who are direct descendants of Japheth, Noah's third son, are now claiming that same territory should be shared with a non-people, a people group called the Palestinians. The false Palestinian claim to Eretz Israel is further backed by many of the eastern nations who've descended from Shem, Noach's first son. But the modern territorial claims put forth through the United Nations have no historical justification. Yet the UN's claim is predicated on the rejection of the covenant made by Yahweh that the territory would be an eternal possession of the specified descendants of Abraham. The UN's claim is a direct reversal of the original curse placed on Canaan by Noach, with the curse now being imposed upon Israel rather than Canaan. Moving on to chapter 10, we find the genealogical list of 70 family groups from Shem, Ham, and Japheth, who all gathered together as one large body on the plains of Shinar, somewhere in the territory known today as Iraq. In verses 8 through 10, we're told Cush fathered Nimrod, who was the first powerful ruler on earth. He was a mighty hunter before Yahweh. This is why people say, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before Yahweh. His kingdom began in Bavel, in the land of Canaan. Now, leaping forward to chapter 11, we find the details about Nimrod and how he was responsible for the building of the Tower of Bavel. In verse 4, the people said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city, a tower that has its top reaching up into heaven, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered all over the earth." The collective mindset of the people was that they needed to defend themselves against the potential of yet another flood. They had most likely not been told or made aware of the promise Yahweh had made to Noach, that he would never again bring about a worldwide flood. However, under the leadership of Nimrod, it became possible to encourage the people to become self-reliant and rely on him as their protector. As the environmental conditions were a stark contrast from what had been the norm before the flood, the people's social cohesion as a means of mutual protection from the constant changes of weather patterns and the ability to provide food that was adequate for their needs. Hence, the building of the Tower of Bavel became a symbol of unity, which occurred sometime during the life of Peleg, who was born in the 16th generation from Adam. While the actual year of the tower being built is not given, it appears to have been around about 160 years, or 5 generations, after the flood ended, which was sometime during the life of Peleg. In chapter 11, verses 3 and 4, their reason for building is explained, where they said, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them in fire," so that they had bricks for building and as building stones and clay for mortar. They said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top reaching into heaven, so that we won't be scattered all over the earth." So having given their reason for building the tower, in the next verse, Yahweh went down and confused their languages. So they stopped building and separated and progressively scattered in every direction. As is stated in chapter 10, verse 11, Yeshua went out from the land and built Nineveh. As we see in chapter 10, verse 22, Yeshua was the second son of Shem, in contrast with Nimrod, who had been the grandson of Ham in the line of Cush. So we can see that as the community broke up after their languages were confused, the descendants from each of the 3 sons of Noah went in 3 separate directions. Now, when we look at the modern world map, we see large ocean gaps between the continental masses. However, it is most likely that the land mass that appeared after the flood was more condensed and possibly even one giant continental mass. What we now know is that continental drift has broken up the large land masses into 7 continents, which are separated by the oceans. However, when we consider the narrative in chapter 10 carefully, we see strong evidence of a cultural drift that took place during the dispersion from the Tower of Bavel. For example, in chapter 10, verses 2 through 5, we are told the descendants of Japhet formed the Western European cultures, who are primarily descended from Gomer and Magog. In verse 5, we're told that they settled in the coastal regions, north and west of the plains of Shinar. Hence, if we look at an azimuthal map, it makes sense that the European people groups migrated towards the end of the known landmass. By contrast, the majority of Ham's descendants migrated southward through the Levant, which borders the eastern Mediterranean Sea, including the modern territories of Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, Egypt, and Libya, and all the northern parts of the African continent. Finally, the descendants of Shem migrated towards the east in verses 21 through 31, where we are given the names of various clans that descended from Shem. Those named people groups mostly populated the Arabian Peninsula, moving towards what we now know as the Indian Ocean. However, the scriptural narrative is related primarily to the line of Shem, focusing solely on Peleg, whose name means division, and his direct descendants following the dispersion from the Tower of Bavel. Then chapter 10 concludes by saying in verse 31, "These were the descendants of Shem, according to their families and languages, in their land and in their nations." Turning back to chapter 10 verse 19, we find that the borders of the territory called the land of Canaan, which was later promised to Avram, is clearly defined. In verse 19, with the northern border at the coastal town of Zion, and it heads down the Mediterranean coastline to Gaza, then turns eastward towards Sodom, which is located southeast of what later became the Dead Sea. Then the border turned northward through the Arabah, is the Hebrew name for the section of the Great Rift Valley between the Dead Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba, which lies between modern Israel and Jordan, and at the top, and heads northward towards Mount Hermon at the north end of the region of modern Golan Heights. Clearly, the territory being mentioned as the land of Canaan was exactly the same territory that was later promised to Abraham, Yitzhak, and Jacob. So the question must be asked, why, at the time of the dispersion from the Tower of Bavel, did the Canaanite people groups establish themselves in the territory that was promised to Abraham, while the rest of Ham's descendants travelled further south and westward into the body of the African continent? The answer is simple: because the land of Canaan, the only portion of land that Yahweh claimed as his own, was therefore the move of Satan, the adversary, who led the Canaanite people and their direct descendants into the territory, knowing full well that it would become an obstacle to Yahweh God, who claimed that territory as his own for eternity. Because if the world landmass is seen on the azimuthal map centered on Eretz Israel, it is still the epicenter of the whole post-flood landmass. 7 people groups who were directly descended from Canaan occupied that territory between the dispersion from the Tower of Bavel until it was given into the hands of Israel under the leadership of Yeshua. Hence, Yahweh removed the Canaanite people before Israel, as we are told by Yeshua himself in chapter 24, verses 11 through 13, when he was speaking to the 12 tribes of Israel on behalf of Yahweh. He said, "You crossed the Jordan and came to Jericho. The men of Jericho fought against you, the Amori, the Perizzi, the Kenizi, the Hitti, the Gehazi, the Hivi, and the Yevusi. And I, Yahweh, handed them over to you. I sent the hornet ahead of you, driving them out from ahead of you. Then I gave you the land where you had not worked, and cities you had not built. You ate fruit from the vineyards and olive groves, which you did not plant." Now Yahweh said he sent the hornet. So what does that mean? If Yahweh was speaking about a swarm of insects, why did he use a definite article, the, in a singular phrase? The English word hornet is a poor word choice for the underlying Hebrew word, which can also mean panic, which is similar to what Moshe said in Exodus chapter 23 verse 28, and again in Deuteronomy chapter 7 verse 20, where he speaks about Yahweh throwing the people of the land into a state of panic. We also have many modern examples when Arab nations have come against Israel and have been repelled by angelic forces fighting with Israel. So the hornet spoken about by Yehoshua was Yahweh going ahead of Israel. However, the modern nations that have attacked Israel have never recognized that Yahweh has not given up on his people's welfare when the enemies attack them from any direction. Chapter 11, between verses 10 through 28, lay the genealogical list of the descendants of Shem, Noach's first son, leading down to Terach, who was the father of Avram, and who was born in the 20th generation from Adam. Then, in verse 26 through 32, the chapter concludes by focusing on the family of Terach, who fathered Avram, Nahor, and Haran, while living in Ur of the Kasdim, which is near the plain of Shinar. Then in verse 31, Terach took his son Avram and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, and they left Ur of the Kasdim to go to the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they stayed there. Terach lived 205 years and died in Haran. There is no explanation why Terach set out to go to Canaan. But we know from chapter 12 that it was Avram whom Yahweh wanted to go into the land of Canaan, as we read in chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Now Yahweh said to Avram, "Get yourself up out of your country, away from your kinsmen, and away from your father's house, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you are to be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse anyone who curses you. But by you all the families of the earth will be blessed." So why will all the families of the earth be blessed by Abraham? It is because Yeshua was born into the tribe of Yehudah, and he is the future king for the 1,000 years, which will see all people resurrected from the nations. Then those who are brought into a relationship with Yeshua after the great white throne judgment will be blessed by becoming part of his eternal kingdom. That is why Yahweh spoke about the blessing or curse in 12 verse 3, which stands in contrast as a constant reminder to the members of the United Nations that if they persist in hounding Israel as a nation, they are exposing themselves to that Abrahamic curse. Chronology suggests that Abraham only spent 5 years in Haran with the family before Yahweh called him at the age of 75 to go to Canaan. At that stage, he was known as Avram, and his wife known as Sarai. As verse 5 says, he had accumulated many servants and the responsibility for his nephew Lot. As we read in verses 6 through 13, Avram kept moving southward through the whole territory of Canaan until he arrived in the Negev. Starting in the north in Shechem, he built an altar to Yahweh, and Yahweh appeared in verse 7 and said, "To your descendants I will give this land." Avram then moved continually southward by stopping at appointed places. He was personally marking out the territory that Yahweh was soon to assign to his descendants as a permanent inheritance. So after leaving Shechem, Avram journeyed to Beit El, which means house of God, where he built a second altar to Yahweh, and where he pitched his tent for an unspecified time before moving further down into the Negev. However, in verse 10, there was a famine in the land, so Avram went down to Egypt to stay there, because the famine in the land was so severe. Now that was the first of 3 famines that impacted on the family. The second occurred during the life of Yitzhak, and the third during the life and time of Yaakov. 3 generations and 3 famines, which go to show just how unstable the weather patterns were in the 550 years between the end of the flood and the arrival of Yaakov in Egypt. Later, in part of chapter 12, deals with Avram's sojourn in Egypt and how, because he passed off Sarai as his sister, which we're told also she was, Pharaoh of Egypt sent them packing. Hence, chapter 13 opens with Avram returning from Egypt, a wealthy man with many flocks and herds. Along with Sarai and Lot, finally they settled between Beit El and Ai, where Avram built yet another altar and once again called on the name of Yahweh. However, it was time for Avram and Lot to part company. Having amassed large flocks and herds, pasturing animals between the two men became a problem. So Lot was offered the first choice where he wanted to settle. In chapter 13, verse 10, he says, Lot looked up and saw that the whole plain of the Yarden was well watered everywhere. Before Yahweh destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, it was like the garden of Yahweh. The land Lot chose was the Arava, which extended northward into the Jordan Valley, north of what is now the Dead Sea. However, in verse 13 it says, Sodom was a bad neighborhood, full of men who were evil in the sight of Yahweh. That allowed Avram to take the hill country to the north and west, which we now know, of course, as Eretz Israel. In response, Yahweh made his first promise to Abraham in verses 1 through 16 by saying, all the land you see, I will give you and your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as numerous as the specks of dust on the earth, so that if a person can count the specks of dust on earth, then your descendants can be counted. Further, Yahweh told Avram in verses 17 through 18, get up and walk through the length and breadth of the land, because I will give it to you. Avram moved his tent and came to live in the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron. There he built another altar to Yahweh. Avram finally settled down, having been promised permanent rights to the territory for both himself and those for whom he was responsible. That brings us to the end of chapter 13, where the scene changes completely with the focus on the wars in the Jordan Valley. But rather than considering the rest of the chapter in this parasha, I want to turn now to focus on Acts chapter 19 and Ephesians chapter 1, as both those two Brit Hadashah readings dovetail with what we have been considering in relationship to the development of the nations following the flood. So turning firstly to Acts chapter 19, it is important for us as Talmudim of Yeshua in the 21st century to consider just how our relationships were in the first century between the people of the Jewish community who had not recognized the Messiahship of Yeshua, compared with the Goyim, or Gentiles, who were coming to know Yeshua. In verse 1, Shaul finally arrives in Ephesus, which was the most prominent city in the western region of Anatolia subcontinent, which is referred to in this first century as being Asia Minor. Now that same territory is now part of modern Turkey. There he found a small number of Talmudim, but as he goes on to explain, they were not at the stage of knowing Yeshua. In verse 2, Shaul asks, did you receive the Ruach HaKodesh when you came to trust? No, they said to him, we have never heard of any such thing as the Ruach HaKodesh. While not specifically stated, it appears that they are all Jews who had encountered Yochanan as the immerser in the early stages of his ministry on the banks of the Yarden River. Having been immersed by Yochanan, they never received the Ruach HaKodesh. Hence, they could not have been present at the temple in 30 CE at Shavuot when the Ruach HaKodesh descended in tongues of fire. Then in verses 5 through 7, on hearing this, they were immersed into the name of the Master Yeshua. And when Shaul placed his hands upon them, the Ruach HaKodesh came upon them. So they began speaking in tongues and prophesying. In all, there were about 12 of these men. One important feature is that they were immersed into the name of the Master Yeshua and began to speak in tongues and prophesy. There is no suggestion in those verses that they were immersed into 3 names, instead only in the name of Yeshua. Now the NIV translation does provide a footnote suggesting that the reference to tongues may well mean foreign languages, similar to what happened at Shavuot 30 CE, and again when Cornelius was immersed. They all spoke foreign languages. In verses 8 through 10, Shaul says he attended the local synagogue for 3 months, which suggests that the Talmudim he had immersed were still members of that same synagogue, even though Yochanan had previously immersed them. During the first 3 months of his visit, Shaul said he spoke boldly about Yeshua and dialogued with all of them who were present at the synagogue. He was teaching about the kingdom of God. But, as always, some who were totally opposed to his message began stirring up trouble among the synagogue attendees. Finally, Shaul withdrew from the synagogue attendance and took his Talmudim with him, and they met daily in the yeshiva, that's the school of Jewish teaching, for over 2 years. And Shaul was continually teaching both Jews and Greeks the message about the Messiahship of Yeshua and about the kingdom of God. People were coming from everywhere to hear his teachings. Clearly, the Ruach was speaking through Yeshua in miraculous ways. As it says in verse 12, the handkerchiefs and aprons that had touched him were brought to sick people, and they recovered from their ailments, and the evil spirits would leave them. Now the miracles that were happening were additional proof that the Ruach truly was working with Shaul, because of what happened in verses 13 through 16. Whenever Shaul and the other emissaries went, wherever they went, they encountered opposition from the adversary. While in Ephesus, Shaul was confronted by a traveling Jewish exorcist who tried to use the name of Yeshua in removing the evil spirits from people. However, even the evil spirits recognized the difference between Shaul and the impostors. As verse 15 says, the evil spirits answered them. It said, Yeshua I know, Shaul I recognize, but you? Who are you? Clearly, even the spirits of the celestial realm recognized Yeshua and his Talmudim. Recognition of the work of the Ruach spread throughout Ephesus among both the Jewish and the Gentile community. As verses 19 and 20 say, a considerable number of those who had been engaged in the occult practices threw their scrolls in a pile and burned them in public. When they calculated the value of the scrolls, it came to 50,000 drachmas. Thus, the message of the Master continued powerfully to grow and influence the people. Now, sometime later, a major furore ignited around the Talmudim. A silversmith named Demetrius, who specialized in producing products for the use of the worship of the Ephesus goddess Artemis, engaged craftsmen in the city to collaborate with him. In verses 25-26, he says, he called a meeting of the craftsmen and those who engaged in similar trades and said, "Men, you understand that this line of business is providing our living. So you can see and hear for yourselves that not only here in Ephesus, but all through the whole of the province of Asia." So this Shaul has convinced and turned away considerable crowds by saying that man-made gods are not gods at all. Demetrius incited the crowd by suggesting that the goddess Artemis could be defamed and brought down from her high standing among the Goyim. He also worked on the assumption that if Artemis was defamed, the livelihood of the craftsmen would be put in jeopardy. But the crowd, in verses 28 through 29, became filled with rage and began bellowing, "Great is Artemis!" Soon the whole city was in an uproar. That whole event was sparked by the messianic message that was being spread among the people of Ephesus, but was finally brought under control by the city clerk, who reasoned with the people and brought about a degree of calm. After the furor died down, Shaul called the Talmudim and encouraged them to leave and go with him on his way to Macedonia. The whole furor is so similar to what has been happening in various cities throughout the Western world, with the riots and street marches and the bellowing and chanting for the removal of Israel, the promised territory. Nothing changes. Like the furor Shaul experienced with mindless ignorance of the city mob, so also the marches and furor of many Western cities are based on faceless, false claims about the state of Israel. We, as 21st century Talmudim of Yeshua, also need to step aside from the mindless political rhetoric that is circulating around because of the people who have little or no knowledge of the scriptural message, and particularly the nearness of Yeshua's return. We who are bombarded daily with such mindless rhetoric, particularly through many different media sources, need to take heed of the words of wisdom that Shaul shared with Yeshua's Talmudim in Ephesus. As we read in Ephesus chapter 1, just as he said in Ephesus 1, verses 1 and 2, from Shaul, by God's will and emissary to the Messiah, Yeshua, to God's people in Ephesus. That is, those who are trusting in Messiah Yeshua. Grace to you and shalom from God, our Father, and our Master Yeshua, the Messiah. Shaul continues in verses 3 through 6, where he reminds us that we have been chosen so that we can bring praise commensurate with the glory of the grace that he gave us through Yeshua. Then in verses 7 through 10, he also reminds us that he has set us free from the burdens imposed by the world around us, and through the Ruach HaKodesh, Yeshua is making known the sovereign plan of God, which is being brought to us through the work of Yeshua the Messiah. Shaul then concludes his admonition with the assurance that all things will be put into effect when the time is right, and all things in heaven and on earth being put in the hands of Yeshua during his reign of restoration. So in conclusion, we who have been called by Yeshua through the Ruach HaKodesh can have confidence that all that Yahweh promised to Avram when he walked the length and breadth of Eretz Israel will be brought to fruition during Yeshua's reign of restoration. Also, the people of the nations that are left over after Satan has been let loose will become subjects of the kingdom of God. Just as Yahweh said in Bereshit chapter 12 verse 3, all those left over will be truly blessed by Yahweh. No longer will there be any furors like the one incited in Ephesus during Shaul's visit. Instead, all the people will know that Yahweh is their God, and they will be subjects of the kingdom. So we can see that the rebellion that began at the Tower of Bavel will finally be removed from the universe at the stage when Yeshua hands all things over and back to his Father, and he and the Father will become one. So until, once again, we look into the progressive development of God's sovereign plan, it is time to say Shabbat Shalom.